I'm an undergrad at UNH, and I completed a lot of this research this past summer at Shoals Marine Lab. And I'm going to be talking about the effects of climate-mediated changes in the diet of Gulf of Maine seabird. Sorry if this is repetitive. But the ocean is absorbing excess heat from the atmosphere that has resulted from greenhouse gas emissions. And this is causing the average ocean surface temperature to increase every year. And this figure on the bottom right shows temperature anomalies over the past century. And changes in ocean temperatures are altering the distribution of fishes. And this in turn is impacting predator-prey relationships. And these climate-mediated shifts have been observed in the Gulf of Maine, which is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. And the Gulf of Maine is shown in that little square on the map. So this makes the Gulf of Maine a really great site for studying the effects of shifting prey distribution on apex predators. And this is the location of my study site. So an apex predator in the Gulf of Maine is seabirds, and they rely on prey to sustain their chicks. And they are also limited by distance from their nest site and water depth when they're foraging. So this makes them particularly sensitive to shifts in prey distribution. Atlantic butterfish are a prey item for a lot of seabirds in the Gulf of Maine, but they're typically a warmer water fish compared to a lot of other prey species in the Gulf of Maine. And they've been shifting their center of population north over time. So this graph shows on the y-axis, it's the different states, so starting south and then moving north. And then that's compared to time. And butterfish is that yellow line, so you can see over time, their distribution is moving north and closer to Maine. And we've been seeing an increase in Atlantic butterfish in the diet of some seabirds in the Gulf of Maine. However, they're often unsuitable prey for seabird chicks because of their shape. So the butterfish is circled, and up there are hake and herring, also really common prey items for seabirds. And from the bird's perspective, looking down on the fish, they look quite similar because they're both narrow. But turning these fish on their sides, you can see that from top to bottom, the butterfish is much wider than those other two fish. And that can cause some difficulties for the chicks that are trying to swallow them. These fish are observed in the diet of common terns, and this photo of a chick trying to swallow a butterfish really shows that problem quite well, because the gape of the chick's mouth is too small for that super wide butterfish. Common terns are what I'm looking at in this research. These are widely distributed seabirds, and they breed as far as the Canadian Arctic and on the Isle of Shoals, which is where my study site is located. They winter in Central and South America, and they're considered threatened in New Hampshire and Maine. They're long-lived until their early 30s, and they are colonial nesters. Care for the chicks is shared by both the male and female parents, and they feed whole prey items to their chicks, which makes them great indicators of marine ecosystems, because researchers like myself can sometimes identify the prey that they're bringing back to their chicks, and that's a reflection of what is happening in the water. So their diet consists of a diversity of small fish like herring and hake, like I mentioned earlier. They also consume invertebrates such as euphausiids and insects. That picture on the bottom right is a shrimp. So my first research objective was to observe the results of butterfish feedings, investigate how butterfish influences growth rate and survival, and also examine the relationship between butterfish frequency and water temperature. And we looked at this to see the ways that climate might be impacting the diet of these birds. So as I mentioned earlier, my study site is located on Seavey Island, New Hampshire, which is in the Gulf of Maine. It's circled in red on that map. And we observed tern provisioning events. And these observations were made from either bird blind or from video recordings, which is what I was looking at. So that photo shows the bird blind. Right next to it is the camera. So we could capture really awesome data of the parents feeding their chicks. And this data is part of a larger ranging data set that is from 1999 to 2020. So for the first objective, we made feeding observations, and we recorded these feedings as either successful or unsuccessful. We also looked at handling time, which is the amount of time that a chick has a prey item in its mouth to when it's either successfully swallowed or discarded. We grouped the prey items we saw into 4 different categories, either butterfish, hake or herring, invertebrates, and other fish. And we're looking at 2018 to 2019 for this objective. And I helped collect the data from these years, and I was watching video clips kind of like this one to collect those data. Then for objective 2, chick growth was monitored from 5 to 15 days to find the growth rate. And then chick survival was monitored to 15 days, which is when a chick was considered fledged. And this data set also ranges from 2018 to 2019. Lastly, looking at water temperature, this data was sourced from an Aracus buoy. In the Gulf of Maine, we took data from about 20 meters deep, and this buoy was located about 27 kilometers away from our study site. And we looked at temperatures from July ranging from 2001 to 2020. And we compared these data to the tern diet data set ranging from the same years. So I want to do a results overview of the diet. So this graph is looking at the variation of proportions of prey seen by nest. So on the x-axis, you have the nest ID. So each column represents a nest. And then on the y-axis, that's the different proportions of prey we saw being fed in those nests. Also, the width of the bar corresponds to how many feeding observations we have of that nest. So wider bars, we saw more feeding observations there. And we excluded any data that had fewer than 10 feeding observations. So you can see that the proportions of prey vary significantly across nests, but something specifically that I want to point out is butterfish. So in this nest that's circled now, you'll see there's no blue bars in this column, meaning that we never saw the chicks in this nest being fed butterfish. But compare that to the nest that's circled on the left, where 50% of those chicks' diet was made up of butterfish. So there's a lot of variation there. And it's really interesting that chicks on the same island in the same year are being fed different proportions of prey. We can also compare the diets from 2018 to 2019. So we did the same thing with the graph on the right. So there not only is there variation of diet in the same year, but there's also variation across different years. So moving on to objective 1, the graph on the left compares handling time, which is on the y-axis, to the different prey categories. And you can see that butterfish took significantly longer to handle than any of the other prey categories we looked at. So butterfish averaged at about 300 seconds for handling time versus less than 5 seconds to swallow any other prey item. But you can compare that to the graph on the right, which shows feeding success on the y-axis. And butterfish were the least likely prey item to be swallowed. So this means that the birds are putting a lot of effort into swallowing these fish, but fail to actually ingest this prey item. This graph is looking at growth rates. Growth rate is shown on the y-axis, and then we compare that to feeding rate. So how many feedings occurred per hour, and we broke those feedings up by prey categories, similar to the last graph. So we had hypothesized that higher butterfish would correlate to lower growth rates, but we didn't see any significant relationships here. However, when we collapse all those prey categories down and just look at feeding rates compared to growth rates, we see an asymptotic relationship. I had hypothesized that this would be a linear relationship, but what we think is happening is that there's a point where an increase in feeding rate doesn't really mean that there's an increase in growth rate because the chicks sort of hit a max growth. And feeding rates overall are a better indicator of growth than breaking them up into prey categories, because this is a better representation of what the chicks are actually eating. This graph compares survival to diet. So the fate of the bird is shown on the y-axis as either fledged or dead. And then we compare that to the diet. So how this graph works is, if we recall back to the first thing I went over, that nest that had 50% butterfish, that means that chick is going to be located at the 50% mark in the butterfish category. That chick was also fed about 40% of other fish. So that chick will also have a mark at the 40% line for the other fish category. So that's how that works. And we saw that chicks that died were fed significantly more butterfish than fledged chicks. And we didn't see any significant relationship between survival and any of those other prey categories shown. So higher proportions of butterfish cause more failed feedings and longer handling times, and this could be what is potentially contributing to that lower survival rate. Moving on to objective 3, we looked at the change in water temperature at our study site. Water temperature in July is shown on the y-axis, and then we compare that to year. And water temperature increases significantly over time, and this is consistent with other findings in the Gulf of Maine. We then compare that to the proportion of butterfish that's shown on the y-axis, and then we compared the average water temperature in July on the x-axis. And water temperature and butterfish are positively correlated over the past 20 years at this site. We also looked at the proportion of butterfish, again on the y-axis, and we split those up by decade, and there have been significantly higher proportions of butterfish in the more recent decade than 1999 and 2008. So what does this mean for the future? As the Gulf of Maine continues to warm, butterfish will likely become a bigger part of tern diet. And chicks that are fed higher proportions of butterfish are less likely to survive. So in order to adapt to shifting prey distributions, adults will have to change their foraging habits. And our data suggests that some terns do have the ability to avoid butterfish, which is super promising. So I want to take a minute for acknowledgements. There's quite a few names on this slide, which makes sense because I had a lot of help with this. But I particularly want to thank the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department and Shoals Marine Laboratory for their support of the Tern Restoration Project, which is how I had access to such amazing data. Also, I want to thank my mentors and my fellow interns at Shoals over the past summer, because they also helped me a lot today, over the summer. And thank you guys for listening. So if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer some.
We do have time. We have a few minutes for questions for Olivia. So first question has already come in through the chat. Bradley says, great talk, Olivia. Are butterfish comparable calorically to hake, etc., or are they less energy dense?
That's a good question. And I know that that information is out there. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I do know that herring are a super good quality fish. I'm not exactly sure how they compare to butterfish. I think that one is a lower quality, but I can definitely find that information for you and let you know in the future, since I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, next question comes from Logan. Logan says, I may have missed it, but do you think, or is there effort looking into seeing if younger tern parents feeding their chicks butterfish, so maybe younger tern parents are feeding their chicks more butterfish than older tern parents? Maybe older tern parents are feeding their chicks better fish.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought. And I don't have the data, or I don't think we know how old the parents were. So that question is kind of hard to answer with the data that we have. But I think that's a really good point. Like, does experience have anything to do with these differences in foraging habits? I think that's a good question, but I don't quite know.
Jenna has the same question for you, so it is a good one.
Yeah.
Any other questions out there for Olivia? Chris Custer, I'm not sure if it's Chris or Erica, wants to know, I think it's Erica, wants to know, do you have any ideas about the year-to-year differences, why there might have been differences between the years you looked at?
Of the proportions of prey?
Yes, I see her nodding.
Okay. Yeah, I think that some of that might just be like interannual variation in climate that year that might change the proportions of prey that are just available. I think that there's a lot of factors that probably go into determining what's going on in the water. Yeah, and there's a lot of changes just between the different years within like weather and spawning and what's going on like the fish's end and the prey's end of things. So that's what I would say for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Olivia, and extra thank you for, thanks for, yeah, stop sharing your screen. Extra thank you for sticking with us with our technical difficulties. As you guys will remember, Olivia is a student and we are collecting student, what's the word? Not evaluations at all, but anyway, commendations for student presentations for any excellent students. So with that, our next speaker is John Anderson. John, can you share your screen? I know John was here earlier. In fact, I see him here now. Yes, I can see your camera now, John. So okay. John is joining us from College of the Atlantic.
And did that work?
Yes, we can see your screen and we can see your slides, and I hear you as well. So go for it.
Excellent. Okay, I'm afraid this is going to be a somewhat tedious applied talk. Not really anything new in theory and not anything really new in terms of surprises. But I can't resist starting off with reference to that noted mathematician, storyteller, and neo-Lamarckian who gave us Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. And those of you familiar with Alice and the Looking Glass will remember the rather gory tale of the oysters who encounter the walrus and the carpenter. And this is what I have been encountering in my spare time for the last 7 years. So as Olivia pointed out, the Gulf of Maine is a most peculiar body of water. It's warming very rapidly. I'm told faster than about 90% of other bodies of water of its size. This was once one of the greatest fisheries anywhere in the world. You could literally go out in your dory and scoop cod into that dory, no need for traps. And you could get lobsters right along the shore. And a combination of climate change and, I'm afraid to say, massive overfishing has eliminated many of the fisheries in this region, which raises a lot of questions about coastal culture and coastal livelihood. The coast is highly convoluted, and there are many sheltered bays which are perfect for aquaculture. And aquaculture has been presented to coastal fisherfolk as being a potential alternative source of income to their traditional fisheries in the near and offshore. So this is an example of an aquaculture site. You can see stretching away to the horizon floats, and this is in the bay that I depicted earlier. And this does provide jobs for people who want to spend their time on the water. Unfortunately, however, there are issues, particularly relating to conflict between what folks here call locals and what folks here call people from away. You can see in the background, there's a nice summer cottage. Most bays these days are dotted with homes that are occupied fairly intensively during the summer months, and then are shut up for 8 or 9 months a year. And the people from away have come to the coast of Maine because they want to have a beautiful view, and they don't find the idea of a working waterfront particularly appealing. The fishermen in the previous picture are going after this. So these are oysters, and oysters have become an increasingly profitable form of aquaculture on the coast. They have the advantage of not requiring the same level of regular intervention in salmon farms, and also they don't tend to increase biological nutrients in the water column. In fact, they are actually cleaning the water column as they go. In this particular operation, the oysters are raised in cages that are suspended below the black floats. So they are very obvious during the period that growth is maximized. And this has also led to a great deal of back and forth, primarily being between the people from away and the locals who see this as a source of future livelihood. And I was drawn into this particular argument a number of years ago because the people immediately abutting this particular oyster farm had gone to just about any lengths to try and block permitting for any aquaculture in the cove. And initially they had tried suing under questions of water quality. It was pointed out to them that the water quality was going to be enhanced by the presence of the oysters. And then they said, what about birds? And this is something that is on people's minds. So this is a stock picture of the remains of the Lockheed Electra that crashed at Logan Airport back in the early 1960s after the engines ingested a big flock of what turned out to be starlings. This is also a fairly historical crash in terms of water birds, because it was partially as a result of the Electra crash that Ian Nisbet and Bill Drury were funded for a very extensive survey of herring gulls up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States and round to the Gulf of Maine. And bands from that study were still coming in years after Bill's death. As I say, it turned out with the Electra crash, this had nothing to do with seabirds. It was a big flock of starlings, but still bird collisions are very much on people's minds. And when the summer people, had failed in their attempts to block the oyster farm because of water quality issues, they turned to the possibility of bird strike. Unfortunately for the operators of the oyster farm, the Trenton Regional Airport is circled in red in this, is within 3 miles of the oyster farm area, and it is within the jurisdiction of the FAA in terms of permitting or refusing to permit operations. So at this point, I was asked to come in and investigate the possibilities of the oyster farm increasing the number of birds in the area and thus increasing the risk of bird strike. I'd just like to draw your attention. I'm not sure if is my pointer visible? No.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you look at the lower left corner of the red triangle, you will see that is the beginnings of a very extensive mudflat that extends to the west, intersecting with the causeway to Mount Desert Island, where I am right now. Throughout the year, this mudflat is a major assembly point for all kinds of species of birds. And my immediate reaction when I heard that the oyster farmers were in trouble was, if the FAA really cared about risk of bird strike, why on earth did they build their airport right next to a major mudflat and loafing site for thousands of birds? that was beside the point as far as the plaintiffs were concerned. And so we entered into a series of wrangles between different litigants, finally resulting in a permit being granted for the oyster farm on condition that I continued to monitor the site for an indefinite period. And so what I'm going to show you is the results of that monitoring, which we're now getting into our 7th year. Initially, the species that was of most concern to everybody involved was the herring gull. And there are indeed herring gulls at the cove. Over the course of our studies, we've seen 34 different species, and total birds seen on any given day ranged from none at all to 310. 60% on average turned out to be herring gulls, particularly in the shoulder season of late spring and early autumn. In the winter, sea ducks tended to increase in numbers, and in January and February, I think our commonest bird were large flocks of bufflehead ducks. So here is a depiction of the gulls over the course of the year. You can see there is a noticeable decline in gull numbers between May and September. That's when most of our gulls are out on the islands breeding and feeding the chicks further to the south. Looking at the overall trend in gulls during the course of the study, there really isn't one. So in 2014, there were no floats in the cove. This is before the permit was granted. And interestingly enough, we had the highest average number of gulls, but also the greatest variance in gull numbers during that period. I should add that these are results taken from 6 to 8 observations every month throughout the year. After that, there was a bit of a decline and then an increase recently. But if you look at this, there is no significant trend in terms of total number of gulls. Focusing specifically on the period when the floats are in the water, the floats are taken out or sunk in the middle of winter. Whereas the Gulf is warming, it's still cold enough that we get ice in the upper bays during the middle of winter. So the aquaculture people tend to remove their equipment during that period or sink the cages to the bottom of the bay. Again, you can see over the course of the study, there is no real trend here in terms of increase as a result of or in relation to the aquaculture operation. All birds counted over year, again, no real trend, no significant increase. And again, during the critical period when the floats are present, no significant increase. Gulls, as I say, were the first villains proposed to the FAA. Ironically, gulls have not been a significant source of collisions with aircraft here in Maine in recent times. Our most recent serious crash involved a bald eagle on one of the outer islands. But when they'd failed to convince everybody that gulls were a threat, they turned to another common villain in some people's minds, the double-crested cormorant. And with the double-crested cormorants, we are seeing a trend in numbers. So at the beginning of the study, we saw no double-crested cormorants at the site. The next year, they started showing up, and after that, they've gradually increased, with the greatest number being this last year. And unlike the gulls, who in most cases were being counted all around the bay, on mudflats, in the water, the cormorants are almost exclusively roosting on the oyster floats. And also, unfortunately, for our interests, it's just the period when the aquaculture operation is at its greatest extent, the summer, when we have double-crested cormorants here in Maine. So they are seasonal occupants in the state. They breed up here starting in May, but they all leave us by the end of October, beginning of November. This is just the period when you've got the most floats in the bay. Looking again at this slide, you can see both part of the proposed solution and the problem. To begin with, I was able to convince the owners of the oyster farm to put these bird spikes on the floats. You can see in the float in the foreground has these long spikes, and they worked very well. The oyster farmers wanted to be more elaborate, and they invested in a variety of hook decoys that on kites they would fly over the floats. Nobody paid attention to them after the first day of deployment. The spikes, however, worked very well indeed for almost all species, the one exception being common terns in August. These are birds that have been breeding in the eastern part of the Gulf of Maine and are on their way south. And every year for about a week, we get them in the cove, and they're small enough they can get between the spikes. Over the course of the last couple of years, the aquaculture operators have become increasingly negligent about deploying the spikes, and the cormorants are taking advantage of the situation. The numbers of cormorants are still very small. I am still perfectly content flying out of the Trenton airport when I want to get to Boston in a hurry. But this is a potential public relations disaster. So things to think about here. Maine is increasingly a single fishery state. We've fished down everything else. 75% of our revenues last year were just lobsters. The warming waters and the introduced species that we're encountering are likely to completely decimate the lobster fishery, some of my friends tell me within the next decade. Aquaculture could supply a significant alternative source of revenue. We're going to have to make some choices in the future, whether or not we are going to encourage operations like this oyster farm along the coast as a way of providing income and jobs for the people, or whether the risks that are perceived are enough to cancel it out. One thing that I confess puts me in a slightly awkward position. Oyster farming is not a blue-collar operation that's one with the people. When I looked it up the other evening, one farmed oyster, if you buy them by 50 oyster lots, goes for $2.60 a piece. That's per oyster. So not the sort of thing that starving academics are likely to feast on. This is very much a luxury trade for, ironically, the same people who would much rather shut down the oyster farm because it bothers their view. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks so much, John. We do have a couple minutes for questions for John, if anyone has them.
What can you say?
Feel free to unmute yourselves or type in the chat box.
John,
oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Erica.
Oh, I just wondered about the spikes. I mean, this is a crazy question, but what are they made out of, those spikes?
They're wire, and they work amazingly well. I mean, I was initially a little bit skeptical. I'd gone to, the first thing I did when the FAA dragged me into this was to go to the literature, and there's been quite a lot of experience, particularly in Canada, looking at ways of trying to avoid having birds on floats like these. And they'd said these spikes worked well, and they were similar to the spikes that the Coast Guard has deployed on their photovoltaics on our islands. And indeed, they seem to work very well. I was amused by how poorly the decoys worked, but I wasn't surprised. Birds tend to adjust very, very quickly to threat stimuli if they aren't real threats.
Yeah, thank you.
Gail.
John, I'm assuming it's jets flying in and out of this airport?
It's jets. It's also propeller-driven planes that are also gliders.
So it's mostly
And
it's the jets that are the problem.
the jets are the greatest concern. I mean, this is an airport where the Rockefeller family traditionally keeps their jet for the necessary hops back and forth to home base in New York. But there is a regular passenger service, particularly in the summer, with small commuter jets flying in and out.
Are you still getting complaints, John, from the cottagers?
The cottagers really have been unpleasant about this. Unfortunately, right now there are permitted oyster farms that are directly opposite both of the X runways at this airport, one of which is operated by a former student of mine. And she was showing me some of the letters she's got where she's been accused of being quite literally a baby killer, because the author of the letter said, it's only a matter of time before the Rockefeller's jet runs into a cormorant from your farm and crashes into the local schoolhouse. So it's that sort of level of, I think, really unpleasant obnoxiousness that bothers me.
Yes. Wow.
All right. Thank you so much, John. I'm going to move on so that we can stay on schedule. Thank you guys for all your questions too. Our next speaker is another student speaker. Emily Johnson is joining us from East Carolina University. And so Emily, feel free to share your screen. I can see your camera. I can see your slides. And do you have your microphone on?
There we go.
There we go. Great. Take it away.
Okay. Yes. My name is Emily Johnson, and I'm from I'm a master's student in the Department of Biology at East Carolina University. Thomas Wentworth Higginson said or wrote that, "I think that if required on pain of death to name instantly the most perfect thing in the universe, I should risk my fate on a bird's egg." And surely the beauty of eggs lies in their pigments and patterns, giving them the appearance of having been painted. And eggs have evolved adaptive features of color and patterning for a variety of reasons. Predation of vulnerable nests has selected for pigmentation of eggs for camouflage. And pigmentation on eggs also helps with thermoregulation of the embryo and reflectance of harmful UV rays. The structural function hypothesis states that protoporphyrin, the pigment in eggshells that gives them the brown and red colors, may have light-activated acts as a strengthening agent in areas of the eggshell that are calcium deficient. Protoporphyrin may have light-activated antimicrobial properties as well that would help protect the embryo from harmful bacteria on the eggshell. And as it relates to colonial nesting, when birds build open nests in close proximity, such as in a myrrh colony, it's important to recognize their own eggs and avoid caring for another pair's offspring. And finally, bird parasitism has driven selection in hosts for female-specific patterning and in parasites for eggs closely mimicking those of the host. And interspecific brood parasitism has often driven a reduction in egg variation with within clutches and the development of female-specific characteristics, commonly known as signatures. The king rail clutches I work with have a more subtle diversity in patterning and color. And because there's so many different dimensions of variation, measuring differences among eggs has been challenging, but new statistical and technological tools have enabled us to enabled better discrimination between eggs based on images. The goals of my study as it relates to egg variation were to determine whether it's possible to quantify female-specific signatures in eggs laid by king rails with the aim of being able to assign maternity And we also conducted a parallel analysis of common moorhen clutches using images collected from a previous study where maternity was known and most individuals were banded as well. In both moorhens and king rails, females may have evolved signature eggs in response to conspecific brood parasitism. Secondarily, we'd like to develop a minimally invasive population monitoring tool using standardized images to assign maternity to based on egg characteristics for managers to be able to track female effort and success across seasons. So these standardized photos that you see at the bottom of the image here, these are pictures of common moorhen clutches. And I put this here to kind of exemplify how sometimes a female's eggs are very distinct to us. So the first two clutches on the left are from one hen and the clutch on the right is from a different hen. So you can see how consistent they are within and between sometimes. King rails are traditionally found in freshwater and brackish marshes across the eastern United States. And historically, they did have a broader range, but they've largely been restricted to coastal marshes now. They raise one bird per season, though they may re-nest if they're unsuccessful. And they have a clutch size of 4 to 13 eggs. In our study population, a mean of 8 eggs. And they are considered to be globally near threatened and to be experiencing a fairly rapid population decline due to habitat loss as wetlands are drained, converted to farmland, or otherwise modified. Common moorhens are another rail species, commonly found in freshwater and brackish marshes, but across Europe, Asia, and even into Africa. They are multiple brooded, so they'll have multiple clutches within a season. And their clutch size is 5 to 9 eggs with a mean of 6.7 in our study population. And they're considered to be globally of least concern. Marked on both maps with a red star are the study sites for these species. The common moorhen data were obtained from a study of a wild population located at Peakirk Waterfowl Gardens in Cambridgeshire, UK, by McRae during 3 breeding seasons from 1991 to 1993. I led the king rail data collection for 2 seasons at Mackay Island National Wildlife Refuge, is pictured below, and this refuge is located on the North Carolina-Virginia border. It's primarily managed for wintering waterfowl, but it does provide excellent habitat for marsh birds, with 4 impoundments that are seasonally drained and filled, and around 2,000 hectares of freshwater marsh. And on this map, I have king rail nests at Mackay that we have clutch photos for, and they're colored by year. And I've shown a few examples of these standardized clutch photos corresponding to some of the nests here on the map as well. For the king rails, our data collection involved first locating territorial breeding pairs via callback. And once we were able to locate an area where territorial breeding pairs would be, we would walk transects or conduct systematic searches of that area. We also did a lot of nest monitoring. So when we found a nest, we would measure the eggs, the length and width, label them, and describe the color and patterning. And we'd continue checking these nests every 2 to 3 days to determine their final fate. So did they hatch, were they depredated, et cetera. And if we found a nest while the eggs were still being laid, we would monitor that daily until the onset of incubation, and then every 2 to 3 days. An important aspect of this project was the standardized clutch photography. When a clutch was complete, we would take a standardized photo with the eggs in the same orientation on a black velvet background on this custom-made board, so all of the eggs oriented the same way, with a nest ID and a color and size standard. So if we remember, the goal of this project was to determine whether eggs laid by king rails and common moorhens have female-specific signatures that allow us to match eggs to the correct clutch. And to do this, I employed the program Nature Pattern Match. It's an object recognition program that detects and matches patterns from images using the Scale Invariant Feature Transform, or SIFT algorithm. This program was designed specifically with egg variation in mind, recognizing that no two eggs are exactly the same, and recognizing the idea that a signature is never exactly the same from egg to egg. Instead, it's representative of a female. And the SIFT algorithm works by identifying features on the eggshell, so spotting, scrolling, or speckling, and then comparing them against those of other specified eggshells in a data set and producing a best match, a confidence, and a ranking. Oh, excuse me. So I ran all the eggs from each year through this program, and I used non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS, to determine the clustering of the data. And I did this using the meta-MDS package in R. For king rails, I used 79 clutches for a total of 475 eggs from the years 2011 through 2020. And for common moorhens, I used 95 clutches for a total of 596 eggs from 1991 to 1993. And unique to the moorhen data set was that this represented, these 95 clutches represented 51 different hens, and we knew the hen identity as well, which was an important factor. Before I really dive into the data with you, I want to look first at some examples of what Nature Pattern Match considers good matches and bad matches. In the photo on the top left, we can see this is our egg of interest, our query egg. And the spotting seems to be fairly evenly distributed over the surface of the eggshell. This also is the case with the egg in the bottom left, listed as the best match. Whereas the spotting seems to be more concentrated around the large pole of the egg in the bottom right, which was the worst match. I've also included the confidence in the match generated by Nature Pattern Match below the images. And as you can see, there's quite a big difference between the confidence in the best match and that in the worst match. If we look at our second example, the egg of interest has its spotting more concentrated around the large pole of the egg. And we see that in the best match as well. Whereas the worst match, it appears that the spotting is more evenly distributed over the surface of the eggshell. Looking at the overall results, and I do want to note at this time that this data is preliminary. These are not final data. So first we calculated some summary statistics. And so the first thing we wanted to know was how often did a queried egg, an egg we asked about in a clutch, match another egg from the same clutch. And so for king rails and common moorhens, that was about 20% and 19% of the time respectively. We also wanted to know how often did a queried egg in a clutch match with an incorrect clutch. And so that was about 79% of the time for each of these species. For moorhens, I noted that we did know the identity of the hens, and we were able to include multiple clutches from the same female in our analysis. So we were able to look at how often an egg was matched, not just to the correct clutch, but to the correct hen, even if it was an incorrect clutch. And so but this only increased our matching by 1%. If we look at the NMDS plots next, these tell us about the nature of the data and the ability to discriminate eggs from different clutches. So clustering of data by hen would show small groups of points. But what we see here for the king rails is a single mass, albeit with shape. And the colors here are corresponding to different clutches, and each point represents an egg. And I've highlighted a few outliers with pictures of the corresponding eggs. And as I said, this data is preliminary at this time. But what we can learn from these outliers is really important. The outliers reveal, such as if we look at the egg in the top left corner, that the axis of the egg, the long axis, must be oriented the same way. Eggs cannot be tilted. That seems to be a problem with the analysis. With the egg in the bottom left, having any shading or shadowing on the egg also seems to be an issue. And overexposure, having an image that is washed out, as we can see from those examples on the right, seems to be a problem as well. For the moorhens, we separated our data by year because the images from different years differed in their photographic medium and the method of digitization from film. So this is for 1992 only, and we see the data is still largely forming one cluster, again, one large cluster. But looking at the indicated outliers, the one on the top right has a shadow on the right side, actually, of that egg. So, but the other two indicated eggs I've pointed out probably actually separated out based on their patterning. So it can give us a little confidence in this analysis. So going forward, at this time, we can say king rail and common moorhen eggs likely can't be matched reliably based on patterning alone using nature pattern match. But nature pattern match might be helpful in instances of hypothesis testing. For example, where two clutches are suspected to be from the same female. And we're continuing to work with nature pattern match to improve our matching at this time. We're also working on using additional egg characteristics in conjunction with pattern variables, so length and width of eggs, the volume, and merge this into a multiple factor analysis. So I'd like to, at this time, thank the very generous staff at Mackay Island National Wildlife Refuge who worked with us, my hardworking field assistants in 2019 and 2020, despite the pandemic, the Department of Biology, my graduate lab, and also the Association of Field Ornithologists for their generous funding of this study. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Emily. We do have some time for questions. Folks, feel free to either type into the chat box or unmute yourselves. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I have one off that I'm curious about. So it seems like the patterning doesn't sort necessarily all that well to individual females, but can you think of other applications for this technique? It seems like a really interesting way to look at egg patterns, egg morphology. I'm curious what else you might think about doing with this.
Yeah, so this is, the program is designed for eggs, but it does have the ability to be applied more broadly. So I know there's a study that actually used nature pattern match with turtles. So, you know, identifying individuals, but I think it could have good application for if you have maybe look at a population level. So if you look at a population in one area and see if an egg comes from this population or from that population, that's a possibility as well. But I think it has good applications for small batch hypothesis testing.
Awesome. We've got a couple more questions. Bradley is asking, are there other competing software tools for egg discrimination besides nature pattern match, or is that more or less the only one?
So there are other programs. Nature pattern match had the sort of least stringent photo requirements. Some of the other programs, there's Spot Egg is another program that seems to have been used a decent amount. Patternize is a pattern match, pattern identification program. I don't know how well it would be applicable to eggs, but that's another example.
Okay, there's a bunch more good questions in the chat. John Anderson is asking, he says he may have missed it, but I assume you input, your input was digital photos of the eggs. What sort of resolution were you using?
Yeah, so the resolution was usually, for the photos, 300 to 600 ppi, so that's pixels per inch. So a pretty standard resolution for most photos.
Okay. Jeff Spendelow has a great question. Are there cases of egg dumping by two or more female rails in a single nest?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So rails have some interesting breeding that they do, and conspecific parasitism kind of plays into this, in that sometimes there is this idea of egg dumping where a female may go into another nest and leave an egg, and so There is that, and we're hoping that maybe with Nature Pattern Match, we may be able to identify some instances of this. It seems it's very well documented instances in the moorhen population, and so we really brought that population in as a way to work with a non-threatened species, data on a non-threatened species, so we could really compare more broadly. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. I think we have time for just a couple more. Logan is asking, have you considered or tried building your own artificial intelligence algorithms or tools for this? He says, super cool.
So we did consider that briefly. It is a little bit beyond my abilities, actually, to work building my own, but we did consider it and look into it, yes.
Okay, one last question before we have to move on. Jill is asking, do you think that the nest substrate influences how the eggs end up being colored?
So that's a great question, and that harkens back to the idea of predation and camouflage. So how much do your eggs stand out, and nest substrate would help with camouflage, the idea is. But the fact of the matter is these eggs are not very camouflaged in nest substrate. They do tend to build a canopy over the nest, the king rails do, so that they're a little bit hidden, but they do stand out pretty well. They're in very dense, deep vegetation. So when there's a bird on the nest, it's very hard to see, but with just the eggs, if a bird isn't on the nest, they do stand out quite clearly. So I'm not sure that camouflage is really a big aspect for the pigment here. And as it applies to their nests, I think they do use probably some substrate to camouflage their nests, but it's very green vegetation, as you can see in this picture, so.
Well, excellent job, Emily. Thank you for your talk. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. And actually, this is going to be our second to last speaker, because our first speaker is actually going to be able to join us at 4:40 in lieu of our discussion. So thank you guys all for keeping with us. Our next speaker is Abigail Lawson, joining us from USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. Abigail, we can see your slides. I don't yet hear you.
Hi, I'm here.
Great, we can hear you. I don't know if you want to share your video or anything.
Yeah, I'm trying to, start video, there we go.
Fantastic, okay, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking my co-authors. Today I'm going to be talking about the focus of my postdoctoral research at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center with USGS. So, as water birds professionals, we have to make decisions under uncertainty all the time. So for example, how do we figure out, say, let me get my pointer here, optimal number of horseshoe crabs to harvest in a way that won't impact extinction probabilities for red knots, or the number of mallards to harvest given changes in land use and climate. Or say that we're tasked with the restoration project. Do we invest funds in restoring eroded coastal wetlands, or try to secure land inland when there's uncertainty about the rate and magnitude of sea level rise? It's important to note, though, that not all uncertainties are as equally important to focus on. So ideally, uncertainties that affect which management action is preferred and can be actually reduced through research and monitoring are the most important to resolve. So this was touched on in a seminal paper by Runge et al. In 2011, which used the example of whooping cranes. So the term value of information, that's a kind of broad catch-all term for types of analyses that quantify the change in expected outcomes of management decisions and how much they could be improved with additional information. However, the data needs for value of information analyses are pretty substantial. So there's a newly developed qualitative value of information that's a promising alternative for data deficient contexts or species. And so with that said, it's no surprise that the qualitative value of information is particularly relevant for the Eastern Black Rail. So just as a frame of reference, the Eastern Black Rail is a small, secretive wading marsh bird that prefers dense vegetation in shallow water, less than 5 centimeters, salt brackish or freshwater wetlands. So they're quite flexible as far as the type of water that they're in. So, and based on a broad scale overview by Watts published in 2016, here we have that the rails were either confirmed or possibly breeding in 298 counties between 1836 and 2018, whereas if you take only entries after 2010, it's dwindled to about 70. So it's a pretty substantial range contraction. Here's another recent study by McGowan et al. So this analysis was PVA using occupancy analysis as a projection. And so this analysis was actually used to inform the recent listing decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we see that under status quo, so which is scenario 1 here, in the mid-Atlantic and Great Plains, black rails are expected to, or occupancy is predicted to be 0 in all the areas that they currently occur in these 2 regions within about 40 years. So as of November 9th, they are considered federally threatened under the ESA. And the primary causes for population declines are habitat loss as well as habitat degradation. So I'm part of an initiative to develop adaptive management frameworks in the Atlantic coast, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. My work and what I'm going to talk about today is focused on the Atlantic. So our objective today is to develop is to show you the result of a newly developed qualitative value of information framework, which is described in a paper, forthcoming paper by Mike Runge, that was used to prioritize conservation actions for Eastern Black Rail habitat improvements on the Atlantic coast. We started this initiative during an adaptive management workshop held in January 2020 in Florida. So again, our main objective here was that knowing that the listing decision was coming soon, trying to develop and identify ways for habitat improvements in areas that black rails occur or could occur. And so we went through a rapid prototyping exercise using the PROACT cycle. And the group was comprised of 26 species experts and land managers. And the bulk of the work in this workshop was done in habitat-based breakout groups. So we identified 4 major habitat types in which the dynamics of the system and rails, as well as management actions available, were sufficiently different to warrant being separated out. So those were tidal high marsh systems, impounded systems, which could be on the coast or inland, in which water could be controlled theoretically. So we realized that was in order to be inclusive. The fact that not all impoundments are functional necessarily, they could have broken dikes. Inland wetlands of Florida. So this is a lot of riverine type of systems in which water levels may or may not be controlled through water control structures like dams, as well as inland wetlands elsewhere, so non-Florida. And so this was kind of a catch-all category to include things like farm ponds or maybe sewage ponds or wet meadows, things like that. Inland habitats not on the coast. So what we asked the participants to do was within their breakout groups to develop conceptual models, which I'll talk about next, as well as 2 to 4 hypotheses to test uncertainties about black rail habitat improvements. So for each hypothesis, we wanted the groups to identify a threat, a management action, preferably in the form of habitat manipulation, a mechanism by which the management action and the specified threat would work, as well as a prediction with the hypothesis. So ultimately, we came up with 13 hypotheses that were presented in plenary to the group. And then we applied the qualitative value of information scoring system, or the elicitation in which we asked the experts to score the hypotheses. So this is an example of one of the group's conceptual diagrams. This is the Inland Florida Wetlands group. So the green boxes denote potential management actions. The red circles denote stochastic events. So things like rainfall or wildfire, hurricanes, things we can't really control. The yellow rounded rectangles denote ecological factors that are known to affect rails. And then our ultimate fundamental objective here in the blue hexagon is to maximize rail occupancy on the Atlantic coast. So to give you an example of one of the hypotheses that were developed from the workshop. So this is a hypothesis out of the Inland Florida group called microtopography. The idea is the microtopographic variation enables consistent access to resting sites and shallow water for foraging, which reduces the need for individuals to move among habitat patches. And if they were to do that, they could be exposed to predators. So you can see here, according to this cute little picture, if the ground is flat, then water levels are likely to fluctuate pretty drastically, and during extreme weather events, rails would be forced to move or drown. Whereas if microtopography is present, so during times of drought, water is still retained in the indentations, whereas during times of high water, the rails still have access to this high elevation, well, high elevation if you're a rail, refugia, so they could get out of it and still have a nesting or loafing site. So the prediction is the variation in microtopography, or simply it being present, is expected to have a positive influence on black rail occupancy. And so the mechanisms, again, are consistent access to foraging, which could improve things like body condition or survival, or the high elevation refugia enables rails opportunity to build nests that won't get flooded. So for the value of information analysis, again, here I've copied the definition I had in the introduction. So the term value of information analysis is a generic term to compute expected outcomes of management decisions and how they could be improved with additional information. The gold standard of this is the expected value of perfect information, which is improvement in performance if all uncertainty was resolved. I think that the best way to explain this is by using examples. So let's go back to red knots in an entirely hypothetical situation. So say the objective was to maximize horseshoe crab harvest while minimizing red knot extinction probability, or maybe holding it above a certain level. EVPI, or the expected value of information, that would represent the additional number of harvested crabs, or crabs that could be harvested, compared to current knowledge if you had perfect information of system dynamics. So if you had perfect information of things like climate change or weather patterns, or perfect observability of red knots to make sure that their populations are above a specified extinction threshold. So EVPI represents the increase. So that said, calculating EVPI, like I said, is very data intensive and can't really be done if you don't have well parameterized models of system dynamics. So what I'm talking about today is qualitative value of information, which is proportional to EVPI. And so qualitative VOI is the product of these two attributes, which I'll talk about next. If you're interested in this relationship, I would recommend checking out Rushing et al. 2020 in Biological Reviews. I'm happy to talk about afterwards, like why this relationship is true. So we asked participants for each hypothesis to score the hypothesis in each of these three areas. So reducibility refers to the degree to which research and monitoring activities can reduce uncertainty. So ideally, a hypothesis, the uncertainty should be highly reducible, so it should have a high score. So more reducible means a higher score here. The magnitude of uncertainty. So this means this is a reflection of the hypothesis's theoretical grounding and support in literature. So say that there were a lot of studies focused on the topic of the hypothesis that were in strong agreement regarding the concept that the hypothesis was testing. This means it would have a low uncertainty. So, or it could be, let's say there were a lot of studies in literature, but they were in strong conflict with one another. That would also reflect a high uncertainty. And then this last attribute represents the relevance to management decisions. So this indicates the potential to reduce uncertainties that will lead to different management decisions and increase the likelihood of meeting objectives. So an uncertainty isn't necessarily important to resolve if it isn't going to change what a manager is doing anyway. So if it has high relevance, it has a higher score here. So again, to get the qualitative value of information, magnitude and relevance are multiplied together. So what we did was we eventually plotted the hypotheses in 2D space with qualitative value of information here in the x-axis and reducibility. And we used natural breaks in those to identify 4 different categories. So over here in the highest, this reflects hypotheses that have high uncertainty and very high relevance to management decisions, in which uncertainty can be easily reduced. Whereas in the opposite category, we have low uncertainty and relevance to management decisions, and it's uncertainty that's difficult to reduce. These last 2 quadrants are relatively interchangeable. It just depends on what you decide to put a premium on. So in our case, we decided to put a premium on reducibility. So given that the urgent nature of declines in black rails means it would be good to make progress quickly, we decided to place a premium on hypotheses in which uncertainty could be reduced fairly rapidly compared to those that would be more difficult. So we called our second most important category high. So these are our results of the different hypotheses produced by the groups. So the different colors indicate the different breakout groups. And so the circle here, these 3 hypotheses, so in decision analysis speak, this represents the Pareto optimal frontier. And so what this means, if you chose a hypothesis outside of this circle, it means that you would be giving up gains in both qualitative value of information and reducibility, versus you would only have to give up one or the other if you selected one of these 3. So surprisingly, after getting some feedback much later from participants in the workshop, as well as other members of the Black Rail research community and management community outside of the workshop, we decided to move forward to develop field experiments around these 2 hypotheses, which I'll talk about next. So the first one is called water application. So that's simply the managed water flows that generate appropriate hydrology for rails. So about 1 to 4 centimeters in water depth with consistent access will have a positive effect on rail occupancy or colonization probability compared to sites with inappropriate hydrology. So simply, if you can manage the water and create this optimal water depth and conditions, that the rails will either stay there or colonize. And then the other one is fire versus other. So this is the idea that if you maintain an appropriate fire regime, that's actually more effective than herbicide, mechanical, or grazing treatments and minimizing woody vegetation encroachment into wetlands that have appropriate hydrology for rails. So the idea here is that fire offers this twofold benefit of releasing nutrients and also maybe getting rid of invasive species, whereas these other types of treatments really offer one of those benefits or the other, not both, compared to fire. So that said, just a little bit of a summary here. So this was the first participatory application of the qualitative value of information. We found a lot of hypotheses that were clustered in the highest priority category. Our thought was that there's actually a lot of management tools that are hypothesized to affect habitat, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how they will affect rails. So it seems like there's a great possibility to reduce uncertainty, but there's been a lot of difficulty in coordinating field studies, especially across a broad ranging like the Atlantic. And then also there could be a recency bias in habitats. So a lot of recent studies have focused on impoundments, which according to some experts, especially on the coast, they may not be a great long-term bet for rails. And so it could be that some of the contrasting literature has produced a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of that literature is recent, and so it's kind of magnified the uncertainty there. And then, so despite the fact that they didn't wind up choosing the 3 hypotheses that were deemed the most optimal, this was still viewed as a useful exercise just to structure some thoughts about uncertainty and figure out where to start. And then also we were able to identify some improved hypothesis development recommendations for use in other groups. So we were able to apply what we learned here to the Gulf of Mexico Adaptive Management Project going on there. So that said, our next steps are to develop power analyses for our proposed before-after control impact field experiments, and then develop predictive Bayes net models and integrate data from stakeholders, and then eventually compare a quantitative VOI once we have all of our models built with what we identified with these qualitative frameworks. So with that said, I'd like to thank the workshop participants as well as the ACJV Black Rail core team, as well as Christy Hand and Amy Schwarzer for their photos, and all my co-authors and funding agencies. I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you so much, Abigail. We do have time for at least one question. Can I say this is really impressive and an amazing framework that you've presented. And I was interested to hear that it's the first participatory implementation of this for birds, for habitat management generally.
Right, so that's a good question. The one other implementation of qualitative VOI is from Rushing et al., and that was a literature review. Mm-hmm. So it was a literature review to figure out what hypotheses would be the most useful to reduce in making land acquisition decisions for the wildlife refuge system. So with that, they were able to score all these hypotheses, on their own time. So, and in having the whole literature available to them. So the distinction here with what I did is this was all done in a workshop setting over the course of about 2.5 days. Wow. On the fly, without having as much thought. So, or I guess preparation and resources available. So it was a way to kind of move forward quickly and make decisions.
Well, we're going to have to move on. I have to say this is incredibly impressive. And if folks want to follow up with Abigail about this approach or ask other questions later, we'll make sure that I share contact information. So thank you again for that talk. So folks, as I mentioned earlier, we did have a discussion scheduled for right now, but we're lucky enough that our first speaker, Morgan Osborne, is actually with us and can give a talk now. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Morgan. And Morgan is our last student presenter of the day. So Morgan, I think I can see your camera. You can go ahead and share your screen.
All right.
Thank you for bearing with us. I can see your screen and I can hear you. So take it away.
All right. Howdy, my name is Morgan Osborne. I am a Master's of Landscape Architecture student at Texas A&M, and I got my undergraduate in Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences. And between that, I was a zookeeper, a wildlife educator, all kinds of fun things. And I came back because I wanted to work with design and figure out how to do some habitat restoration. So my final project is on adapting Venice to the rising tides. And we're trying for a multifunctional performance-based urban design approach to this flood resilience. So what is the background problem? Venice was built on basically a sandbar. They drove these 60-foot poles into the ground hundreds of years ago, and it caused them to become basically a concrete foundation where they built all of these historic, iconic, monumental architecture and things like that. So with high projections of the tides, with the Aqua Alta, which is the extreme high tide, in projection with the aggressive sea level rise, this is St. Mark's Square. And if the aggressive projections become true, in 2010, the square will become, or not 2010, 2100 will become completely inundated. And that is really bad because it's not only this great cultural hub, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site with 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 criterion listed. So this means that there is significant art, there's significant architecture, archaeology, a significant struggle with the elements that the city has overcome, and that there's a very unique habitat in this area that they wanted to make sure is preserved, which from a regular human standpoint is great. It's beautiful, it's awesome, it's a cool place to be, but from an environmental standpoint, this is causing a lot of problems, especially with all of the tourism and the ports. So there's air quality concerns, water quality concerns. This causes a lot of problems. It's forcing people out of their homes on the island. In the last 100 years or so, 60% of the residents have moved inland, and it's causing a lot of issues, but it's very difficult to work with because of this UNESCO World Heritage Site and the fact that it is built in the ocean on a finite surface. So what does that mean for the environment? Well, based on the IUCN Red List, if you look at Veneto, which is the region that Venice is in, which would be this whole region on this little fun map, there are 126 vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, or extinct species listed south of the mountain range. And when this is limited to the forest, the wetlands, coastal, and artificial settings, it brings it down to 70 species, but 23 of those 70 species are listed due to urban and residential related threats, while 18 of these species are listed due to tourism and recreation concerns. So four of these species, a big charismatic species, the green turtle, they can do their nesting here, they can do feeding, things like that. And then three charismatic kind of birding species, which would be the horned grebe, the Balearctic shearwater, and the common pockard. And these guys are all having issues because of the urban and residential related threats and the tourism. But how can this be combated when people are moving inland from Venice itself during all of this flooding? So what makes this project that I am working on different than other projects? I just want to start off by saying that we are still in the first semester of working on this, and that the end goal is to create some sort of modular retrofitting park that will help by putting in small areas where it's needed to connect waterways, as well as creating a sediment flow into the lagoon itself. And we're focusing on 3 levels of resiliency as counted by Reed and Botterhill. So social resiliency, which would be how the community itself adapts to different things. Social or ecological would be the interpopulation adaptability, and then the economy, which would be how to mitigate negative impacts from these disturbances economically. So these are 3 big things that are human related focuses that can be easily kind of translated into land use, because if you look here, these are all of the wetlands that are listed in the specific area that I'm discussing. And while this area here was traditionally salt flats, and within the last about 100 years, we've lost from 72 square kilometers to 45 square kilometers of salt marshes in this area. So the shipping channels, this is a large port area here. Oh, sorry. This is a large port area here. So there's dredging that's happening due to these large ships coming in these inlets. And so the area is deepening. And so the wetlands are they're depleting. The water itself has been diverted out of the lagoon from all of the major rivers. So there's no real strong sedimentation that is happening. So I believe that there was roughly 1 million or so sediments, something like that, coming in per year. And now there's 30,000, something like that. It's a very significant decrease. So for this small area here, this is the Naviglio Brenta, which is part of the Brenta River, where it was traditionally going into this lagoon. The main river itself has been diverted away towards the southern portion of the lagoon, but I was going to focus my study on this area because, as you can see, it's almost entirely agricultural related, and artificial surfaces with these very small intermittent green surfaces. One thing that is super positive is that about right here, there is a large park that can be tapped into, which can allow the migratory effects of the fish, the birds, and everything like that to connect a little bit better through this corridor. So it's kind of, we're trying to break it into 3 or 4 phases, with the first phase being from straw to dolo, which would be the beginning portion, and then it's segmented to these different areas. So each of these areas has a channel lock or a gate locking system with the waterways. And so if you look one way from this bridge in Dolo, you'll see that it has the lock and it's very concretized. But if you notice here, it's very open and free. That's just the other side of the bridge. So there's like a lot of man-made mixed in with natural areas. So it can be difficult, especially with all of these historic buildings lining up next to the area. So for what I'm discussing right now, I'm going to focus kind of on the phase 1, which is the straw to dolo. While these are kind of like phases, these are just areas of focus where we're going to try to put a couple of large areas of parks so that it will connect this corridor. So I started off by doing some GIS modeling, and I did a least cost corridor path between the green and blue areas, which would be green space, waterways, and some wetlands. We don't have any wetlands directly in this area, so that's unfortunate. So that's going to be my main goals, to trying to redesign these areas back into the places. So the least cost corridor is in reference to least cost energetics wise, based on what was ran through GIS with elevation. So this is not what will cost necessarily the least. It will be the most energy efficient for an organism to move from one place to the next. The darker black lines are just going to be where the dashed lines have crossed so many times that they're becoming one straight line. So I noticed that there is a strong area here, and this area in here. This is actually the limit here where we are discussing for Dolo, the city. So this is the first area that I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to go into it a little bit. So here's a little bit of the background of what is going on here. This is primarily a city area right along the road. So as you can see, it's historic buildings, very beautiful. There is also some warehouses and things. There's a large area where it's industrialized and commercialized, which actually backs up directly to the water. As you can see, like there's not that much of a buffer here. So it's easy for the water itself to, if it were to overflow or anything like that, it would cause a big problem with not only businesses, with homes and things like that. One interesting part of this area is that it is considered to have a Po Valley forest of English oak and ash and alder. So this is a native forest patch that is here. But as you can see, this is actually someone's backyard. So the best in this specific area for green spaces that we can hope for is trying to connect people's yards and give mitigation areas. Finally, there's intensive and continuous sowing of the crops. So these areas are very high row crop density, things like that. So these are going to be where the majority of the runoff is coming from, and the concerns are causing these problems. So we're just now starting to get into the actual benefits and how we are going to actually design these green spaces now that we've identified the nodes where we're going to work from. And based on the Green Values National Stormwater Calculator, if you, in this small area that I had just shown, if you were to limit the imperviousness by 4%, which currently it is listed as 84% in this small area, based on the buildings themselves, if that were to be, if 4% of that were to be replaced with wetlands that contained native vegetation, and that is not considering trees themselves, this is just talking about forbs and ground non-woody perennials and things like that, that the groundwater replenishment for just 1 year would be $1,000 American for just this area. And the total treatment benefits would also be limited. So what we're trying to do is collect the water, treat the water, and hopefully restore the groundwater. There's a lot of subsidence in this area because of groundwater pumping in the last century and things like that. So if we can collect and keep as much of the water as we can, that's awesome. But how's this going to work? Because it's such a tourist and residential area, the design concept is going to be similar to this compartmental model. Kind of similar to what Odom has discussed previously with his compartment model. So with the areas like St. Mark's Square, these are areas that are not next to each other. So don't get the wrong idea, I guess. But the tourist areas are heavily populated. They have a lot of people coming in and out, a lot of businesses geared toward that. And then the residents themselves don't necessarily enjoy being right up with the tourists. So by using a linear park or a linear stormwater management area in the form of a wetland, we can allow residents this opportunity to come in and out of the green spaces regularly, and it's with some sort of ease, while the tourists have access to this area and they could go through the green area and get to the residential areas if they need be, and the residents can have easy access to the tourist areas, but there is this big green buffer between the two. And moving forward, we're focusing now that we've identified where these green buffers and these constructed wetlands are going to go, now we are going to spend the next couple of months determining how much water we can hold in each wetland, how much water we need to hold in each wetland to make sure that we can mitigate the bathtub effect inside of the actual lagoon. They do have these gates called the mosaic gates that are currently being utilized to limit flooding. And they only work for a very specific range. So it's 1.1 to 3 meters. And so St. Mark's Square inundates at 80 centimeters. So there's a small area of St. Mark's Square that will be completely inundated before these gates are even open. So while these gates are open, we need to make sure that the fresh water is not mixing too much in the lagoon and causing a bathtub effect that is detrimental. So this is where we are going, and hopefully within the next semester or two, we will be all finished with this. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Morgan. We do have a few minutes for questions. If anybody wants to type one in the chat box or unmute yourselves. I'm curious, what's the connection between the project that you're working on and implementation on the ground? Are there?
So currently we have some contacts in Venice. This originally started as a studio project for the master's studio level. And so many people have proposed different things, and there's always competitions in the design world going on because this is a very serious problem that's happening right now. So we do have some feedback coming in and out with Venice itself, but we're hoping that maybe once we get a little bit more of a design going, that we can propose it to officials. And what makes our design different from other designs is that we're trying to consider not just tourism, not just residential, but we're trying to connect the ecological as well. So that's what makes it stands out from the other projects that are, if you Google Venice design, you'll probably find 100 projects, but they'll focus mostly on 1 or 2 of those aspects. And we're really trying to dive into all 3 of them simultaneously.
I have a few more questions unless anybody else has some and wants to jump in.
And I can't see the chat box, so.
I'll keep an eye on that too. So I'm curious, from a climate change perspective, whether projected changes in sea level are explicitly part of your planning when you're thinking about wetland restoration, whether that's something that you guys are considering.
Sea level rise is probably one of the largest factors that we're going for, or that we're focusing on from like an environmental aspect, I guess. So we're trying to do the entire project based on water management with the three aspects behind, like, as guiding beacons. And I just lost my train of thought. Could you repeat your question? I'm so sorry. It's been a long day.
Oh, not at all. Yeah, I was just curious about whether climate change, sea level rise, for instance, was explicitly part of your planning when you're thinking about the placement of parks or wetlands.
Yes. So we're trying to, the sea level rise is one of the most important characteristics because we're actually trying to capture that water, capture water coming inland for runoff, which is currently causing some of the like local sea level rise due to like the lagoon bathtub effect and things like that. But from this standpoint, we're trying to start up and work our way down so that we can meet sea level rise. Hopefully it would be when the mosaic gates would no longer be functional once it's reached 3 meters, which for this area, according to different estimations, it could be anywhere from 50 years to 300 years, but it's definitely coming. And so we're trying to find ways to mitigate that.
Any other questions for Morgan? I have to say, thank you. It's really great to hear this perspective from the sort of landscape architecture perspective. It's been really great. So